All right. So this is my first brown bag, so be gentle. But anyway, today I'm going to be going through HoverConf and just run through all the things that they announced in that probably a couple of months back now. But basically 8 hours of CSS talks in 45 minutes. So what is HoverConf? It's the first of 6 Web Directions conferences this year. It's entirely online over 2 consecutive Fridays, and they've got a bunch more coming up. So Lazy Load, which is performance, has already been. Global Scope, which is JavaScript. Code, which is PWAs and the web platform. Access All Areas, which is accessibility. And Safe, which is security and privacy and identity. And so basically the conference was all about CSS. It's the first time they've run it as all CSS. And there were 14 talks about all sorts of things. We are going to go through all of these, so I won't dwell too long. There's a lot to do, so I'm going to go pretty quickly, so it's not going to be hugely detailed, but I've tried to put a lot of details in the slides, and the slides will be available after this. So first up was What's New in CSS 2021 with Adam Argyle, who's a developer advocate at Google. And it was a rapid fire of 31 new features, varying levels of risk, risk being how likely they are to actually come about. So like the high risk ones, they might be more like your stage 0 JavaScript type stuff. They're being talked about, but they're not here yet. Moderate risk might happen, low risk probably happen or is probably already here. So some of the cool things in particular, like some of the container queries type stuff, a couple of new color things, conic gradients, a bunch of focus stuff. The focus visible is quite nice because it's around stopping you from having the outlines when it's using the mouse, only when it's on keyboard. So all of these are linked off to his slides, which were quite good. So there's a lot of information in there. So you can get back to there quite easily. There's the resources and his Twitter. Next up was container queries and the future of CSS with Miriam Suzanne. She's literally writing the spec for container queries, so she was a good one to talk. And so she went through the at layer, which was quite interesting. It's kind of like a way to group and override the cascade. So basically you can have a layer of default stuff, a layer of themes, and a layer of components. And your component stuff will always take priority over the theme and default stuff, and basically in the order that they're used. They're separate from normal CSS specificity, but inside them, normal specificity happens. And if there's any unlayered stuff, they are like an implied highest layer. You can add styles later. So in this case, we've got a bootstrap, and then we've got components, and then we import a bootstrap file and add it to the bootstrap layer. The component stuff will actually still take priority because it was used first, that layer. Scope was the next thing she talked about. It's still being discussed heavily in the GitHub issue, but the idea being that from a top level down to a lower level, you can scope it and say, okay, all anchors between media and content are affected by this, otherwise they're not, which is kind of nice. And then on to the main event. Container queries are one of the most interesting things coming. And they're basically media queries, but based on the container width, not screen. So it's really good for component driven stuff like design systems and the React kind of model, because it matters where you put it, not necessarily how big your screen is. So in order to do it, you need to have a container type, which basically says this is the part that I'm measuring. And then you have an @container rule, which looks very similar to a media query. So if the container has a minimum width of 30 ems, then it'll do something. And so here's a full example with a card and at a min width, it changes the grid layout. So the image and content are together. I have that one here. So it is behind a Chrome flag, but you can enable it in latest Canary. So all of these cards are exactly the same, but using container queries. These ones that are bigger can have that background image. These ones that are smaller can have the side-by-side images. So it's kind of cool. There's a bunch of code pens there related to it. Next up was Mark Dalgleish with the state of CSS-in-JS. And so he just went through a bunch of the latest libraries. So style components and emotion are still the big two. But there were a few other ones that he went through. So one called Goober. It's got a similar API to style components. It's got a very small bundle size. And so here's an example of that. So this looks very familiar for anyone who's used style components. The only difference is this setup. And that's because it is framework agnostic. So you can use it with Preact and a bunch of other things. So you just need to pass in the create element. So that's pretty cool. Next one was Stitches, which is from modules. So it's not as flexible as style components, but it's more declarative because you can declare these variants. It's got good TypeScript support and it's good for static extraction. So an example of this one, it's more of the style object kind of way of doing things. And here's a variant example. So you have a button with some variants, color, violet, gray, and the styles inside that. And so then you can just literally have button color violet. So that's the variant, which is a nice way to do things. Vanilla Extract is by Seek Open Source. So this is actually the one that Mark Dalgleish is working on. So he's slightly biased, but he put it at the end, so he wouldn't be. And their goal is to have a zero dependency library. So it's like CSS modules, but written in TypeScript. So you get type checking, but then it exports out as CSS, so it doesn't have any dependencies. So here's an example. So it's a bit more like the variant style. So you can create a theme, and then you can use that theme. And so notice down here, we've got a double D. So that's a type error. Large doesn't exist. So it gives you that that typing, which is quite nice, but still compiles down to raw CSS. So it's very cool. And the last one he talked about was called compiled from Atlassian. And so what that does is it extracts it to atomic styles. So similar to something like, what's it called? Tailwind. It has a single style for a single rule, and that can then be extracted to a static CSS file as well. One thing I liked about it was it uses CSS variables for props, which is pretty nice. So it does need to be statically analyzable, so there's no runtime styling, but if it can't extract it, it does have a runtime fallback. So it'll pull out what it can and then go back to the style components kind of way if it needs to. And so here's an example. It's again very similar to style components, which is cool. And here's a compiled example. So it also has a CSS prop, which you can use. And so what that compiles down to is this. So see, it's made a CSS variable with that prop and a few crazy class names, and then extracts to this CSS file, which is nice. So there's a bunch of links to all the different ones that were just mentioned then. And so next up was CSS aspect ratio. And so the old way of doing this is the padding top hack. So padding in percentages based on width. So to have something that's 16 by 9, we have a height of 0 and a padding top of 56%, and that gives us the right aspect ratio. But there's a new way. So aspect ratio is part of the CSS box sizing module level 4. So Chromium 88 Plus, and basically you just got aspect ratio auto or the ratio. And here's a little demo. So aspect ratio 16 by 9. Trying to change that to 9 by 16. So there we go. I can have 1-to-1, I can have 4-to-3, and it just works it out without me needing anything else. So that's quite nice. And so that's part of Web Compat 2021. So Google's working with other browser vendors and industry partners. They're trying to eliminate the top 5 pain points. So they're focusing on flexbox grid, position sticky, aspect ratio, and CSS transforms, which is quite cool. So there's a few resources there. Next up was Matt Colman from Atlassian on CSS variables for real life. So he was saying, oh, CSS variables seem cool, but I don't know anyone who's actually using them in real life. And so he went out and he found a few use cases in his daily work. So real life situation number 1 was the Jira deployments view. And so the thing here was that these table rows could be hovered. So they change color between white and various grays. And the way that they've done this gap between these lines and these circles is by a border of the same color. And so that was an absolute pain to do. And then he went, hang on a second. CSS variables, I set it on the top level when it's hovering, and then they will all get the right color. And so that was his answer there. Situation number 2 was he was thinking back to when he worked at Domain. And so their design system has scaling text. So if normally it's 14 pixels, but if it's got a min width of 550, it's 30 pixels. And if it's got a min width of 800 pixels, it's 50 pixels. So it gets bigger as your screen gets bigger. And the way that they did that was basically they had media queries all over the shop, just fixing it whenever they had text. And so he did a little proof of concept in this code sandbox where at the top level, you just have media queries for setting your variables. And then anywhere else you need it, you can just use that variable and you're good to go and you'll get the right one. So it just reduces a lot of nesting and a lot of duplication. And real life situation number 3 was with design system tokens. So a Figma workflow, kind of like what we have. You could say, this is supposed to be 16 pixels and try and double check it. But in the typography of Figma, it actually says that it's a H100 or a large, semi-bold large, or whatever we've got. So wouldn't it be nice if you could check that against DevTools? Well, with CSS variables, you actually can. So it'll show the variable rather than the actual size, which lets you really easily double check and go, hey, yep, no, this is the right one. It should have been a H100. Makes it easier to eyeball. So there's some resources there too. Next up was typography superpowers with variable fonts and CSS. So Ananya went through what are variable fonts. So they're something like a single font file that behaves like multiple fonts. They look like this. They use the font variation settings, and there's a bunch of fairly common ones as well as custom ones, but weight, width, italics, slant, optical size. They're fairly common ones, and they vary by font what they will do, but it gives you a lot more flexibility. And so there was an example, vfonts.com, which basically lets you play with it. So you can infinitely sort of adjust this to give you a heap of control, and different fonts have different possibilities. So pump, which is pretty interesting. There was also Liam, when we first started with GT Flexer, did a similar playground with variable fonts. And so there's our font, and yep, you can make it wider, you can make it thicker, you can make it italics, you can make it dance. It's very cool, and it gives us a lot of flexibility with typography, infinite control. So there's some good resources there. And next up, so Rachel Andrew talked about understanding display, and this was pretty deep. It was sort of a back to basics look at the display property and the box model and how it all works. Like everything is boxes, and boxes can be block or inline. Flex boxes are just block boxes with flex children. Grid boxes are just block boxes with children in a grid formatting context. And there's a two-value display syntax, which sometimes makes it clearer what's going on. So previously we'd say display block. That's actually display block flow. Flow root is block flow root. Inline is inline flow. And so then when you get to flex and grid, okay, flex is block flex, inline flex is inline flex. Grid is block grid, and inline grid is inline grid. So that simplifies by being more explicit the two value syntax. Definitely worth looking at her slides. It was an impressive presentation. So I think this was the start of day 2. So halfway. So neurodiversity and why you hate CSS. It basically came down to CSS is partway between a designer and a developer brain. And that's why people struggle with it. It's not all codey, it's not all design, it's sort of a bit of both. And he talked about Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. He said, designers are commonly visual spatial, programmers are commonly logical mathematical, but CSS kind of needs a little bit of both. And that's why a lot of people struggle with it. And he talked about a Twitter poll that Max Stoiber did about a simple cascade, and lots and lots of people got it wrong. So that's a good link there. Up next was the new CSS logical properties. And so these are getting away from directional naming. So it's for right to left languages and things like that. So it changes. So top becomes block start, bottom becomes block end, and left and right can be inline start and inline end. And so that way, if you're in a right to left language, inline start is actually the right hand side, and you don't have to invert what you think. Margins similarly have changed. So margin top is margin block start, margin bottom, margin block end. And so left is margin inline start, right is margin inline end. Width and height also. So width is then inline size, max width, so max inline size, and height is block size and max block size. And positions also change. So they've got an inset prefix. So we've got top is inset block start, bottom is inset block end, left is inset inline start, and right is inset inline end. And so there's a lot of new things to learn, but the good thing about the inset in particular is we now have a new shorthand. So previously, if you wanted to have top left, bottom right 0, you'd have to put it out explicitly. There was no shorthand for it. But now that we've got this, we've got inset 0, which means top left, bottom right 0, which is helpful. You can also do it as the 4 values as well. Next up was Kilian with Beyond Responsive Design, New and Future Media Queries. And so prefers color scheme was the first one. So dark mode, everybody likes dark mode. And this is how you can do it. And this is quite well supported. You also introduce a cheats dark mode. So rather than having to go through and do it properly on an existing site, what you can do is you can invert the color and then hue rotate back to the right hue. And what that means is you'll get an approximate dark mode of what your existing site is. But your image and videos will be inverted. They'll be negative. So you just invert them and hue rotate them back so that they'll be the right colors. So you don't get as much of that negative style. This prefers reduced motion. So animations are awesome. They make everything good, but some people can't handle them. And so they can set their setting to prefer reduced motion. And so when you do this, you can reduce the number of animations so that they don't get seasick or whatever it is that they have a problem with. There's also a cheats version of that. So basically, if they want to reduce motion, you can just basically turn off all animations and transitions and scroll behaviors, and that'll just give you a simple way to give them a better experience if that's what they've asked for. There's also prefers contrast. So these are getting more into the experimental, not quite ready ones. So there is partial support in Safari Technology Preview. But basically, if they want higher contrast or lower contrast, you can add extra styles for that. So I think that ties into on macOS. There's a system preference for I want higher contrast, and so that's why it's partially supported. One of the new ones prefers reduced transparency. So oftentimes you'll get text over images, and a lot of people struggle with that. So there's going to be, or there might be, a prefers reduced transparency media query, so that you can make it a bit more obvious for those people. There's no support for that one at the moment, but it's being discussed. And prefers reduced data is the last one, and so there's no support for it either. But essentially, if you're on your phone and you want to save data, you can not download images or download smaller images, and just reduce your data output in your CSS. So there was a big article that he wrote on media queries, which is quite useful, and the can I use for that as well. The next one was CSS comparison functions. And so this was a quick talk. It was just around min. So min is good. So you can have the minimum of 50% or 500 pics. You've got max, which is the maximum of 50% or 500 pixels. And there's clamp. And so clamp gives you at least 200, preferred 50%, but at most 1,000 pixels. And so it's basically a min and a max mashed together. But the good thing about clamp is you can also use maths expressions. So normally you'd have to do calc to do this sort of stuff. But with this one, we can have a font size that's between 12 pixels and 100 pixels, and then set it based on the viewport width and viewport height, which is kind of cool. And he went on to say, this is the next step after responsive design. Responsive design, we've kind of gone to, oh yeah, I've got a phone, a tablet, a small monitor, and a big monitor version. And he's saying with this sort of stuff, we can have the infinitely adapting sort of layouts. And so he wrote an article on that, which is quite helpful. The next one was move over TypeScript. Here comes TypedCSS. And so that's all about the typed object model, which is part of Houdini, which covers a lot of things. But essentially, the problem is that CSS is not typed. When you say width 500 pixels, it's width with a string of 500 pixels. And so this is sort of changing that, so that with an attribute style map get, we now get a CSS unit value, which is a value of 500 and a unit of pixels. So we no longer have to do the splitting ourselves. We can actually do it properly. We can also set it. So instead of having to do string manipulation to set something, we can set the width to a CSS.percent of 50. And so that gives us 50%, but it could be CSS.pixels 32 or CSS.ems. There's also CSS math sum, which equates to calc. So if you have, well, it can be used in calc. So we have 100% plus 20 pixels, and then a viewport width of 100, and then to string it, and then we can see that turns into a calc. And we can set that directly without having to turn it into a string, which is handy. And going back the other way, we can also do the same thing, computed style map. So we can take a calc and we can get the computed style map and turn it back into a CSS math sum. And so we get access to all the parts of that as expected, which makes it a lot easier to work with in JavaScript land. And finally, there's a CSS style value.parse, which allows us to actually validate, is this a real value, and catch errors, which is handy. So the slides and a code pen there. The second last one was a bit of a fun one, was how to draw with CSS. So you might have seen people doing all these crazy illustrations in CSS and wondered how they did it. Well, Michal showed us. So she had a couple of examples. So drawing Pikachu. So this is actually drawn just with CSS, and it's essentially clever use of a bunch of linear gradients, radial gradients, and it's pretty impressive. But it even animates. But like I can get rid of. So here's just a bunch of divs. So the ketchup bottle, get rid of that, and it disappears. So that's all just in CSS. So it was a really cool talk. She talked through how each of these things, just using different border radiuses and radial gradients, you can make this sort of stuff. And this one was a single div kite. So this entire thing is just one div, which is pretty crazy. And so there it is. There's your one div. So everything from the clouds to the kite to the little bows is all just on this one div. And so basically there's a bunch of gradients, a use of box shadow to make the little bows, a border radius to make the string, and then she's animated it as well. So it was a neat one to dig into. And so there's a collection of a bunch of other stuff that she's done as well. And finally, there was a special webbed briefs with Heydon Pickering. And so basically, it was a bit of a trippy video on the 6 ways to draw a line on the web. And so you could do a horizontal rule, an SVG, a UTF-8 encoded SVG background image, repeating linear gradients, use Houdini paint worklets, or just do it direct on WebGL. It's worth a watch. It was pretty odd, but goes for about 15 minutes. So the link's there as well. And so finally, Ben Buchanan is quite famous for doing his big stonking post where he basically writes an entire conference in a blog post. So he's got this here, which has a whole bunch more information, links to all a bunch of other stuff that was there. So that's worth digging into if there was anything that piqued your interest. The hover site and web directions on Twitter. The end. I put a Go link up for the slides, so these are available later on. They're available now. I went nice and quick. Cool. Were there any questions?
Yeah, hey Chris. I missed the first 15 minutes. I was just wondering, one, I guess, what your personal highlight of the conference was, and then I guess 2, what's your biggest takeaway in terms of where CSS is headed trend-wise?
Good questions. So probably the biggest highlight for me was probably seeing the container query stuff actually coming to life. That's been a big one for a long time, particularly with the move to component-based architectures. Media queries don't really cut it when you can chuck the same component in a big box, a little box, and everything in between. So that was probably one that I was really excited to see actually working in real life. Also, the CSS drawing was kind of cool, just from a less less useful but more interesting kind of way. In terms of where CSS is going, it's definitely going more towards the sort of personalized experience. With a lot of those, the media query ones, they're moving more towards adjusting to you and to what you want. So the color scheme, the reduced motion, it's giving you more control and to make it good for everyone. Also, if we look at the 31 from the beginning, there's a lot of accessibility stuff as well. So we're getting the ability to set the marker, to set the focus visible so that everyone doesn't just get rid of the keyboard navigation highlights and stuff, and giving us just a bit more control of things that we sort of have workarounds, but giving us a better way of doing things. So like nesting, there's is like SAS style CSS nesting is coming. The layering stuff's really cool because a lot of the time we have to work around the cascade in order to get it to work, and it's really confusing once it gets deep. If you can say, oh look, this is my theme, if anything else is trying to fix that, I don't need to put importance everywhere. Just know that this is my application styles and they should take precedence. And that's really cool. The Houdini stuff as well is really cool. It's giving us developers the way to sort of reach into the browser engine and do stuff like with the Houdini layout stuff. They're talking about being able to do masonry, and so have a masonry and layout, which is like the Pinterest style layout, right, where it packs it all in. Houdini Paint, giving you the opportunity to write your own sort of CSS filters and things. So yeah, it's interesting stuff. It's interesting stuff, definitely. There's a lot of cool stuff coming, and a lot of stuff that that we work around is coming, which is a good thing.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. Super good. Super interesting talk.
No worries. Cool. If there's no more questions, thank you very much. And see you later.